1, 0.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to yet another cracking edition of The Matt Brown Show. This is the Built-in New York series. If you've been living under a tree or in a tree and under a rock and you don't know what's going on, I'm connecting you to amazing people building incredible things and solving real problems that matter to the world. So today I'm really privileged and honored to connect you all to Brandon Bendez, the president and co-founder of Ogmend Orthopedic Technologies. Brandon, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Pleasure to be here.
Privilege is all mine, man. So I've really been chatting to you quite a bit for various reasons, but we'll get into all of that. But you've got a really interesting background. You've been a venture capitalist. You manage your own funds. There's a number of medical device startups that you're responsible for. So for our viewers around the world who haven't heard of the amazing work that you are doing, I'd love for you just to kick us off with the background to you, like what you're about, and then maybe give us the origin story to Ogmend Technologies.
Sure, absolutely. So I have a little bit of a unique background, which is kind of atypical for people you see in this industry and in my position that aren't necessarily clinicians, being that I'm at a medical company, right? But I am an accountant and management consultant by background. Worked with a number of large corporations, including healthcare companies and providers, and really helping them with strategic positioning in pursuit of eventual exits. So it could have been acquisition, could be a merger, could be listing or a secondary offering. But I realized that by doing this, I knew what strategies worked well and then what didn't when running a business. And it happened to be that I accepted an opportunity from a close friend that got me involved in the investment world. So for the last 13 years, I've been involved on the investment side, building neuromusculoskeletal and orthopedic businesses. And after working at a number of these different companies and building a number of these different companies, they all touch on almost every aspect of the human body from an orthopedic neuromusculoskeletal perspective, right? You have arms, legs, spines, knees, hips, joints, types of things. And what we recognized was it was clear that there was a consistent and highly common challenge experienced by surgeons in our field. So that led me, it happens to be actually, that my partners had met a surgeon a while back who had a really simple, brilliant idea to solve one of the biggest challenges in orthopedics. So we had purchased that IP, and then that's how I wound up here. We created a company, built the product, and are now serving customers and surgeons in international markets. So a little bit of a different background because I came from the business side and got into the clinical side, where you typically see people with more of a clinical background doing what we do and solving the challenges that surgeons face on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to paint a picture, your aggregate exit proceeds are in excess of $800 million. So you seem to know what you're doing. What would you attribute your success to? Because you didn't need to get into clinical medical hard, you know what I mean? Like the space that you're in, you could have gone into a different spaces. So, and also, by the way, like I've learned, having obviously spent some time with you and having the time I've interviewed, I'd say probably like a dozen startups. Now, some are publicly listed, some are still privately owned, but that are doing like medical hardware stuff, which is like, for me, it's the pinnacle, the apex, you know, of hard things about hard things when it comes to startups. So because it's hard, it's interesting to see how much success that you've had. So I'm curious to understand, what do you attribute your success to in this particular space that you play in?
Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words. I think, you're giving a lot of credit to me where I think a lot of credit also goes on to the surgeons and the clinicians who do this. So while the business side, sure, I've played a role in the business side, I think the clinical side is more a testament to the experts who are the clinicians who have that background. But yeah, we've been very lucky to have some very good successes in this world. And I think it comes down to two things. It comes down to making sure that what you build actually works, right? When you go to do something, at least from my perspective, and this is just the type of mentality I embody, is you go to do the best in what you're doing for an indefinite time period. So I'm not here to make a buck. I'm not here to build a business and get out of the business. You want to make a real difference. And if we're all lucky enough in life, right, we'll make a difference for our families, for the world, for the entire population that lives here on Earth. So the goal was create these technologies and create a good business from them, sure. But at the end of the day, you have to have something that works and something you take pride in and something you're building for the long run.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So let's talk about woven for a moment. So, what exactly is the problem that you guys are solving within the woven business currently?
So, interestingly, specifically for neuromusculoskeletal and orthopedic surgery, we are addressing one of the biggest challenges that surgeons face, and it's rather unknown to the public. And before I tell you what the challenge actually is, there's something you need to know about orthopedic surgery, right? And I think everybody watching will appreciate this once they understand this about orthopedic surgery. When surgeons fix bones or when they perform surgery, what they're doing is they are performing a lot of work to align your bones, adjust your bones, to get them into an anatomical position so that the bones can heal properly. A lot of work goes into looking at that, angles of where things have to be and what they have to do and what position they have to be in. This, in my opinion, is actually where all the hardest work and all the most mentally challenging exercise come into. It's all the planning. Then secondarily, which is what we as people typically think the surgery actually is the surgeons then using screws and hardware and other types of devices to then hold their work in place so that bone can heal properly. That's the secondary thing after really doing what they're supposed to do. And the biggest unspoken challenge is, how do you get good results and good outcomes when the environment in which you are doing this surgery is not conducive to allow the hardware to actually hold everything in place? So, I mean, to give you a perspective on this, 25% of screws that are put into the body don't achieve good fixation. In fact, over the last 12 months, two studies, one internationally in Japan and one here in the United States, were suggesting that 72% of patients that go in for a multi-level spine surgery are going to experience some sort of loosening event with their screws within 2 years of the surgery. So what's happening is there are these underlying chronic issues that affect the bone quality or the bone healing, so that this hardware, it's really hard, it's really difficult to get that to hold all the work in place. I'll give you examples: osteoporotic patients, smokers, diabetics, severe types of deformities. It makes it really difficult for a surgeon to do this work. So it's an unspoken challenge of how difficult this is and how frequently surgeons have to deal with this, because we just expect, oh, it's a simple surgery, it's a simple procedure. Just, I have a fractured arm, align that thing, stick it together, and we're good to go. And the answer is, the screws and the hardware, that's the underlying issue there, is just getting it all to hold their work. So that's the problem we're here to solve, is how can we give the surgeon a tool so that regardless of what scenario they're in, they can get these things to hold properly so that their bones can heal. That's kind of what we've done.
Got it. So again, if you are listening to this purely on the audio feed, head on over to the YouTube channel. I'm showing some videos of what this technology actually does. It's truly remarkable. Brandon, how big is this market opportunity? Is it kind of like anybody with a bone-related surgery? How big is this opportunity for woven?
So there are billions of screws that are implanted annually, right, in a variety of indications. You see screws used in surgery on animals. You see screws used in surgery in your back, in your legs, in your hips, in your knees, in your face, right? So this can be used. It was intended to help the surgeons restore really bad scenarios like this. So there are a variety of scenarios that can be used, but the concept and the theory was, when you have this, what we call a compromised scenario, where it's hard to get the hardware to stay and it's hard to actually put those in, you would use our device, which I didn't even mention it yet, but it's called the Ogmend Implant Enhancement System. And what we created is a wall anchor, like one of those wall anchors or wall plugs that you'd buy at a hardware store or see used in construction. It's one of those that gets inserted into the bone right before a screw is inserted, and it helps hold the screw.
It's very, very interesting. So what went into the product in terms of was it like a R&D driven process? Like, walk us through, how do you create something like Ogmend?
Well, that's a really good question, because it has a lot of facets there. The first one, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is the surgeons, right? The people who are using it. You need their feedback. You want to know what's important to them, where the challenges arise, how they arise. So that's, without a doubt, we went to speak with these people first. But it took about 2.5 years to design the initial prototypes here that gave us the outcomes we wanted. So it's easy to create something, right? You can create anything you want, but it's what your creation actually achieves at the end of the day. And we went through a number of iterations that were the same product type, but it didn't achieve the outcome we wanted. And what we wanted is, we wanted you to take your worst case scenario. So think of like trying to mount a TV on your wall at home, and you try to put your screw in a hollow wall. Or think about it, a lot of bathroom doors might be hollow, right? You try to put a screw in there and mount something on that thing's going to rip right down. It's going to rip right through the wall. So we tried to give me the worst scenario you have, and let's restore it to if a surgeon was operating in the best scenario possible. So there was a lot of iteration to get the product to do that. So it took 2.5 years to do that. It took 2 years worth of testing in animals and significant data and analyses to make sure that this worked in an in vivo, right? A more human-like scenario. And then after that, you have to go to humans. So then we did another 2-year study in human use to see how this would and what would wind up happening when it was used in humans. So altogether, when you really think about the timeline to develop something right like this, right, you're looking at 8 to 9 years is what you're seeing.
Mm-hmm. And that's a really interesting timeline, isn't it? I mean, it's pretty much like a 10-year, 15-year cycle typically for a hardware. I'm saying hardware, quote unquote, but medical sort of startup focused on hardware devices. So you've raised 23.5 million to date just for Woven. There's obviously the other portfolio of companies that you have. How do you, and this is almost like a kind of, it's a little bit different for me in terms of the context of this question, in the sense of, I know that you manage your own funds too. But how does a startup in your context approach an investor, special purpose vehicle, or maybe a fund, in the sense of the payback period? Because it seems it's obviously a lot longer than just a SaaS company, you know. So how do you approach raising money for something like the kind of product that you have created, where there's a long payback period, there's FDA approvals, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera? How do you approach something like that?
So there's various stages, and the first thing, allow me, I do want to tell you, we've raised a little under 20 million in this company to date. So I know there's information all over the internet. We have to be really careful where we get it and who says what. But I wanted to at least put that out there. We have, plenty of bodies that are looking at how much we raised. I don't want anybody to think we've raised more than what we've classified and claimed legally, right? So number one is there's a little under 20. I would say when I was on the investment side, right, and really managing the funds and helping with the investment opportunities, it's staged. So you talk about this long-term timeline, and what people don't recognize is that is pretty much always the case with these hardware or biotech companies. The difference is a lot of it is unseen because it hasn't achieved the investor access necessarily yet. You haven't gone to the external markets to get it funded. Typically, these technologies are developed at institutions, at educational facilities, at labs, by surgeons. They might be funded by hospitals or by grants. The federal government in the US, at least, plays a major role in funding a lot of the research and a lot of development that happens. So you might go into the public markets a little bit later in that timeline. This company with Woven, we happened to found it from absolute scratch, which is unusual for I will tell you, it's my first time ever founding a company from zero, from a piece of paper with IP, right? you would typically will play at a much later stage when there's prototypes developed, maybe even some regulatory that's been approved or some testing that's already been done. That's typically the stage at which investors see some of these technologies. So when you go to the market and raise a fund, it is a shorter timeline, generally speaking. That's number one. Number two is when you raise these special purpose vehicles to do this, most of the people and funds that you're dealing with will vary by the stage. So if we are an earlier stage and there's still testing that needs to be done and development work, we might have way more investments coming from foundations, from endowments, coming from clinicians or clinician groups, right? Where they understand how this works and they can get involved on the scientific and clinical side of things. So that will be predominantly what will be the bolus of your earlier stage funding, along with some grants from the NIH, from the federal government, from various organizations. When you get later, your Series A, your Series B, and you start to get into the regulatory clearance side or start to get into the commercialization side, you can start going to these angel groups and organizations, and you can start going to funds that would invest into your special purpose vehicles for specific purposes of shorter timeline, more evidence of potential success, which means a little less risk initially, but it's staged, right? So we're raising it based on, and we've had funds across the board. So we've done funds that invest in very early stage. We've done funds that invest in more middle stage, and we've done funds that have invested in later stages. And the people that are in it will differ depending on what their investment goals are.
Just an observation from my side. As I mentioned, I've had quite a few guys on the show and women on the show who are in the medical space. So there's companies like Acutus Medical, there's Psychceutical, there's Tracon Pharma, there's Biotricity, and many, many others. And what I found as purely just as an observation is how many, and by the way, those companies are all in your context, meaning hardware, medical devices. Biosig is another one. And what I found really fascinating as an observation is how many of them, which is super high, I would say it's probably like 80-90% of them, choose to fund their startups through the public markets and avoid the private market funding altogether. Why do you think that is?
Well, I got to tell you, I'm really interested to hear from the people that you've spoken to hear from you. Why do you think they've gone to public markets, right? So it also depends on the technology from my end, right? The public markets, if you go in that direction, you can typically raise a lot more money, right? That is what, if especially in an initial public offering, no matter where you do it, the access to cash is much, much larger, right? Your funding capacity is higher. The challenge there is on the logistics side for the company. There are a lot of rules, a lot of regulations, a lot of, and even staff, for lack of a better word, right, that have to go into the company in order to then manage a public company. When you are at the stage where that makes sense, then I think it's a brilliant way to fund a company, right? Where I play in on the smaller side, I think that the trade-off, the resources that are required, the capital that's necessary to support a public business at this stage is more than what I believe will allow for a more successful return later because of the companies I play in, right? If you're in a biotech business and you're going to sell your business for billions of dollars, then you can afford to raise $500 million, right? $100 million, because your return is going to be more than capable of covering that capital outlay. But if you're a smaller business and you're selling for hundreds of millions, for example, which is what a lot of our businesses do, raising 100 million or 200 million starts to eat in to your potential return. So I think it's a stage thing, and if you're in a company and in a stage where you can afford to do that, then it makes a lot of sense. For ours, it doesn't. I'm really curious some of the founders that you've talked to about it. What do they say? What's the impetus for going to the public markets?
Yeah, I think with the inability to quote them, but I think my sense is that they choose the public markets, and I think you're right around the volume of capital like that they can access and fund quite quickly. And I think it's also a different type of investor. So, for instance, if I let's just say Matt Brown was in the medtech hardware space, and I didn't know who you were, where you have these funds or other investors, or investment funds, SPVs that are specifically looking for medical hardware, startups to invest in or companies to invest in. If I didn't know about them, that's an issue. But when I look at the public markets, and also I'm looking at the way that they list their companies, some are doing reverse mergers, some are doing uplisting, some are doing pure listings, and it seems to me that the type of investor that you are looking to fund your medical hardware company is very different to, say, a VC person, where they're looking for relatively quick returns, 3 to 5 years maybe, but they're not in the game of 10, 15 years. It's the different type of investor mindset. Whereas a retail investor, my sense is that they are compelled by the vision that the startups or these medical hardware companies are looking to create or manifest in the world, like Biosig, it's a heart arrhythmia based stuff. Biotricity, a lot of the stuff is actually in heart arrhythmia solutions, different contexts. Some are looking at signals, some are looking at literally mapping the signals of the heart itself. Some are looking to, in your case, provide like other types of hardware solutions to really acute scalable problems. But my sense is that it's a different type of investor. So they don't want to look at the private markets necessarily unless they know that they have relationships where they can access funds such as the ones that you manage. So they're looking for investors who believe in the vision and they're prepared to wait for a return. That's kind of my sense.
Okay, which makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, that comes down to the investors, what their actual investment goals are. And I'd say from our perspective, absolutely, is some of our funds make sense for that quick hit, but the people who play in the public markets, they're definitely in for the quicker hit, right? I think it's very rare, unless you're investing in indexes or certain types of REITs or investment vehicles that are more for cash receipts year over year instead of just that kind of exit opportunity or the capital appreciation opportunity. Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, my sense is like the private markets are not as liquid as they were, 2 years ago. And so if you're looking at which by the way, public markets are also being hammered. If you look at the share price of a lot of these companies, like they've taken a hit massively. So I don't know. I don't know. And I think it's horses for courses. Is at the end of the day, it's like, this is our vision. We want to raise X amount of money. What's the fastest way and easiest way that we can do that? So whether that's public or private, again, I suppose it really depends on the nature of the business and what they feel is the right long-term strategy for their particular business and context.
Yep, good point. And what we're seeing, which is also wild, you made me, right, your comments actually bring up a point here, which is the markets are converging, right? I mean, look at what the government in the US is doing with crowdfunding and the access to private deals that no one ever had before. So while there's still plenty of differentials between a public company and a private company, right? I mean, it's always going to be that way, but the access is now changing drastically, where you're seeing a lot more people who may not, from a company and from an investor side, who didn't necessarily have access to private companies, who now do. So it will be interesting to see how that environment changes and how that evolves over the next few years, because we're seeing a big change in those that are interested in private investments from our funding perspective, right? There are a lot more people, there are a lot more groups, there are a lot more opportunities now to invest in private companies. So we'll see how that translates into the fundraising environment generically.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I actually just Googled because now I was curious. So according to NASDAQ, the question I asked was, how long does it take to actually list a company on the NASDAQ? And according to NASDAQ, it's 4 to 6 weeks. That's a very short period of time to get access to a lot of retail capital or public market capital. Whereas if I asked a startup, at Series A, say, stage, and I said, like, how long does it take for you to raise your Series A? The answer's not going to be 4 weeks.
That's true, but I think there is a the hidden concept behind that, which is when you officially apply to get listed, maybe that's how long it takes to go through the listing process. The challenge, though, is you have to create your prospectus. You have to then go get your financials audited. Right? There's a lot of steps for documentation and things that you have to produce and provide in order to get listed to begin with. So maybe the official process is a little bit faster, but actually getting there is a whole different story. And then once you do all those things and you list, there's still, right, there's a whole industry, investment banking, which then has to go out and get your investors to invest. You typically, at least on a primary investment, right, you don't just float shares out to the public market and let individuals just go buy up your share. You could, I mean, you absolutely could, but typically speaking, there is a very structured process to allow people to buy big blocks of shares and large portions. And that whole entire process is a long one. So while definitely for listing, I get it. I've actually been a part of companies going public. I would say I wouldn't. I'm trying to think. In my experience, and the last time I brought a company public, it was over 10 years ago. So I would say the timing isn't that different from when you try to start your capital raising process as a private company to getting to closure and doing it. It actually might be faster to go the private way than to go the public way, given all the different tasks that you have to execute for public. And it costs you a lot of money to do it publicly too. So there's the trade-off, right? As you said, it's depending on your goal as a company and how much you need and what stage you're in, that's going to dictate what your plan is and what you want to do.
Yeah, it is obviously in NASDAQ's interest to say 4 to 6 weeks.
Hey, if that were the case, I'd love that. Someone get us listed in 6 weeks.
Let's go, baby.
Fantastic.
Let's go, dude. Oh, that's classic. So I want to quickly talk to you about scale. So in this context, like, you basically created this grafting device almost. It's kind of like what's the wording you used? It was kind of like a wall plug for human bones. So assuming you get FDA approval at some point in the near future, how do you scale something like what you guys have? Is it a case of going through distribution company? Do you go direct to hospitals? Like, how do you scale medical hardware?
That is the $1 million question that I think everybody will consistently ask for the rest of life, right? It's how do we do this effectively and what's the best way to do it? And I've interestingly, is through various clients and through the businesses that I've been a part of, what I feel is that I've started to see and recognize a trend in what seems to work better than others. Doesn't mean it'll work correctly for everything, but it's proven itself to me. So it's something I'm going to try with a lot of my companies and do it this way. It helped me and my partners sell a couple of companies in the past for some very nice exits and very nice returns, and did well in getting surgeons to use it. So this is one of the strategies we consistently implement, but it comes down to support and trust with the surgeons. So for a company like ours, Woven, we're actually in a unique scenario because our technology is actually not like anything else. We are almost more of a commoditized product in orthopedics than your typical device. Typical devices will be thousands of US dollars, takes a lot of training, they're complex to get out, you have to go support every single surgery. Ours is the exact opposite. It's a low-cost product. It's so easy and simple to train that you don't need to support every single surgery. So I don't need to have a team that's constantly in the operating room and the operating theater to help a surgeon. The training's very quick and easy. So this is almost an entirely different model. But at the end of the day, the way you approach them, it's very simple. You have to get to the surgeons one by one, realistically speaking, in the beginning, keep it small. Allow some surgeons, a select group of surgeons, to use the device so you can get some feedback and you can learn. How is it really being used in practice? It's great when you study things and you ask questions before you launch a product, but you don't really know how it's going to work until you see it working. So we'll go out and we'll find a small group of people. We'll launch a product originally with that group. It's a close-knit group. We're looking for feedback. We're looking to monitor patients. We're looking to generate great outcomes. And we're looking to identify the potential problems or challenges that could arise when using this, and challenges across the board, right? Something as simple as, is the box too big, right? And where it's a pain to keep on the shelf, or do we see it work differently in one person's hands than another person's hands? And how do we train people for the differences in intersurgeon relationships, right? And once we learn that and we come up with the techniques and the solutions to essentially perfect it and get it to work as consistently as humanly possible, we will then go and expand. And the way we do that is we will pull in the right partners to get to the right surgeons. Sometimes that's building a direct force. Other times that's working with distributors and distribution partners. Other time it's having a manager come in and then run a web of agents and distribution partners. So it really depends. But I think what's more important is understanding the access points and how to proceed through that pathway of get to your surgeons, learn, get to more surgeons, support, and keep moving that way. The means to the end is the distributors and the agents and the employees and who you hire is just the vehicle of how you get from one to the other. But I don't want to tell you that's the strategy, because the strategy is all about how do we capture the surgeon attention? How do we train them so that they're using it appropriately? How do we support them so that after they're trained, they're using it appropriately? And then how do we maintain that relationship and continue to generate good results? How you do that doesn't matter as long as you do those four things.
Very interesting. I want to change gears and talk about patents. So to my knowledge, you have around 31 different patents, active patents currently for what you guys have developed. What role does patents play in creating an unfair competitive advantage, or maybe a sustainable competitive advantage in your space?
Interestingly, on patents is I have a slightly different perspective on patents. I think patents are nice for our industry, right? In certain industries, patents are essential. In our industry, I think patents are great. I think they are much more overly hyped than the function that they actually, or the advantage they create, because you can always come out with something else that does something similar, but is just created in a different way. The same way that technology is evolving so rapidly now. Can someone create something like ours where it's a sleeve that does this kind of thing? No, you really can't, because we've patented around everything, the methods, the way it works, how it interacts with the bone, how it's put in, how it's placed, the structure of it, right? So it would be very difficult to do something like that without infringing on patents. But then that doesn't mean you can't do it in a different way. So I think patents are important to protect what you have and provide you with a little bit of an advantage for a certain period of time. But then you're up against things like, okay, well, that's great, but how do you prevent someone from coming in and just infringing anyway? I mean, we see every day that there's a large billion-dollar company who's willing to take a hit on IP because they say, if we get sued or we go after this, then we'll just pay out the fee or we'll pay out the fines. So it's a deterrent, absolutely. And it helps create protection. But I think we overvalue patents in our world. In the biotech world, when you're on drugs and pharma, absolutely. Then, right, patents are essential. For us, they're a piece of the puzzle. But I think there are a number of other pieces that also play to ensure that you have good protection. And one of those pieces is regulatory. Depending on the approvals you obtain and how you position yourself regulatory-wise, other companies that try to come in and create products like yours may have to do significant amounts of testing and show significant proof to get approvals. And if you can force them to do that, now you have like a two-headed monster, right? So we do have an approval in the US for use in trauma surgery. It's not our first primary market, so we'll be launching hopefully in spine if we can get our approval in spine, but we do have an approval in trauma, and it's a certain approval that has set that bar so that if anybody wants to come in and copy us, they need to go through a significant battery of tests that will take many years to do. So it gives us a good lead over competition to say, we welcome you to come in, but it's not going to be easy to do it.
You know what I love about, I just keep playing that video that you sent me of the actual sort of grafting. I call it grafting because I don't. I'm using it because I'm a lamest person here, but in your context, but it's so simple. You know what I mean? Like it's so different to say, something that Paul Lammers is doing in Texas around cancer T1 cell activation for treatment of specific types of rare cancers. Do you know what I mean? Like it's a totally different thing. Like this is like a screw going into a spine or screw going into an arm or a leg. It seems to me like the things you ingest are very different to the things that like the thing that you kind of like plug into your bone. You know what I mean? Like it's a different type of complexity. And I hear you around the patterns. It seems to me like on let's just say the biopharma side of things, it does seem to me on the face value of it that patents do play a more pronounced role than say something that's more hardware based in your context. Does it make sense?
I think you're right, because the chemical compositions of these things are so unique that you can't, right? I mean, there's, for lack of a better way of saying it, if you find a drug, right? If you find a pharmaceutical and you created a specific chemical composition, right? If you want the same results, you're going to have to use the same chemical composition. You can't just switch around a couple molecules here and wind up with the same results. So that patent's enormous, because if no one else can copy that, then they're not going to get anywhere close, most likely, with something else. So that is huge for that industry. In ours, you still have the opportunity to use other methods of doing these things, because, okay, fine, take a screw, for example, right? You change one attribute of a screw, and all of a sudden you're not infringing on someone else's IP for their screw. So there's more opportunity there. So it creates a barrier, but it's just the magnitude of safety that creates for your protection is way less in our field than it is in like a biotech field. I would agree with what you're saying. And yes, it's simple, right? I mean, at the end of the day, there are two ways to innovate. You can either create something that no one else has ever done in the history of mankind, right? And that's one way to innovate. A lot of people have done that, and those should be the unicorns and these, $100 billion to $1 trillion companies. That's what should happen. But then you also have innovation, which is I hate to call it incremental, because that's truly what it is in terms of taking steps. But you create other innovation that makes things better, and actually better. The problem is when you incrementally innovate and how much more benefit you get is very little, right? That's where the problem occurs, is when your incremental innovation is basically nothing. But there are two ways to do it. You can make something better, or you can come up with something entirely new, right? And the way that I like to see it or deal with it is your cancer drug, right? Or things like this, entirely new, right? Something that hasn't been done. Whereas somebody like a WhatsApp didn't invent phone calls, right? WhatsApp didn't invent having conversations over technically Wi-Fi or over the internet, right? VoIP did that before WhatsApp. WhatsApp just perfected all of this into a really, really simple scenario where you put it on your phone and you're done. And now you can leverage all these things. So they didn't invent any of these, but they just made calling, especially for international communication, a lot easier. So that was our goal, is make things. I'm not a clinician, I'm not a scientist, right? So I'm not going to come up with a breakthrough drug myself. But what I can help do is create something and drive some innovation that makes things a lot better. And that's where I try to play.
And the other thing I've learned is that once they're in the biopharma space, as long as that patent's active, you're making money. But the moment that patent expires, it's like it's dead. Like the money-making opportunities just fall off like a financial cliff very quickly. So it's like 10 years of innovation, 10 years of FDA, and then lots of money-making in a period of time, and then the patent lapses, and then it's done. At least that's my understanding.
Great point. And that's not the case in our industry at all, right? We have, my partners helped create a very prevalent technology 30 years ago at this point that's still a market leader. So to your point, that's a really good point, is yes, there big difference between the two.
So Brandon, I'd love to change gears for a moment. So obviously what you're doing is hard, and you've had a lot of experience, a lot of successes also. So what would you say has been your greatest failure, quote unquote, in this journey of woven? And what did you learn from it?
So, it's interesting because I say this to my family, kids, wife, the whole deal. I am eternally optimistic in general, and it's very difficult for me to actually pinpoint something. When you were coming out of university too, you went to your interviews. What's your biggest failure? What did you screw up the most? I find it nearly impossible to answer these questions because even the things that don't turn out the way you want them to, you just learn 2 or 3 things that then allow you to turn out the thing you didn't want to. So I'll give you a great example. Just in general, not of a failure, but what you're learning from where you're going is everybody looked at COVID and said, my goodness, this is going to destroy my business, right? In our world, we have a product that's used in elective surgery, which means it's not a life-saving surgery, which means when you have events like COVID that shuts down hospitals, the first thing hospitals and medical facilities do are cut back on our surgeries because they have to care for people who are potentially going to die, right? Their priority number one. So during COVID, our business essentially shut down in terms of sales. We couldn't make any sales. They weren't going to be doing surgeries. We had to fight for a single surgery, that might have been categorized as necessary through being involved in an emergency procedure, right? However, and most people would look at this and say, well, we're done. This is big trouble. What are we going to do? What we did is we said, well, wait a second. Right now, you have a lot of really good surgeons who are at home not performing surgery because their hospital said, we're shutting down on this, forget it. So what we wound up doing is we got in touch with all the surgeons we possibly could, different partners in tons of different countries across the world in different regions to say, well, let's have conversations with everybody to see what the opportunity is or what the interest is to allow access to Ogmend in other regions around the world we wouldn't necessarily have gone into originally. And when you do that, the reason we did that is we said, we don't know what markets are going to open up first. So if we talk to all these different people and we see what the opportunities are, then maybe when markets start opening, we can leverage one of these if we need to, right? Well, so we just took a really bad situation and leveraged it a little bit. And now we're looking at this a year later, and our growth is through the roof, right? We're growing at hundreds of percentage points per quarter because we're able to initiate access into markets that we never would have had otherwise, because typically you don't dedicate that amount of time. So and I look at that across the board, whether it's testing, whether it's a test we did or something we learned or regulatory approval we were going after, or a clinical scenario we're trying to solve. I don't think my expectation is ever that something's just going to succeed immediately. So if you don't have that expectation, I'm not quite sure what I would call a massive failure. There are things that I would say, well, I won't make that decision again, or now I have to pay attention to this type of environment so that I do something differently in the future. But I got to tell you, there's not many things that I regret saying, well, that was really stupid. And, this was a huge failure that screwed up everything. I think you have to have a number of different balls and choose the ones that work, take your risks and go for it, knowing that there is a potential big failure there. And if you know that that's the case, is it really a massive failure? It's expectation management, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's a great point. I often find I don't know, I subscribe to the philosophy things are always happening for you. You know what I mean? Like when you lose a deal or where you don't raise money through that investor, I believe things happen for a reason. And so if one door closes, another one opens. It's just that you have to be open to what transpires in your world in a given point in time. I know the only times things that have really scaled when I founded 14 startups over the last 25 years at a couple of exits. So all the successes I've had is by believing and letting the market dictate where things go, as opposed to being in love with your own Kool-Aid. You know what I mean? This is it, this is how it will always be, and this is what we want to scale. Maybe in some cases, but it's so low, it's single digits, maybe 0.5% of the time. Otherwise, it's always a case of developing through failure, quote unquote, towards something that you didn't anticipate you would own. Does it make sense? So I don't think I've ever started a business started one, not bought one, or acquired a product and then scaled it, started a business and wound up with the business that I thought I would. You know what I mean? Like, like I thought it'd be
Absolutely.
like a media company, and like, no, you're a lead generator. You know, it always changes, because when you start, you don't know really where things are gonna go. So I hear what you're saying.
Well, and to that point, right? Would you, if I then asked you which one of those businesses was your biggest failure, unless, and I'm right, unless you shut the doors because the company just literally failed, it went bankrupt, and that was it, which thankfully and luckily I have not had to do yet. I'm sure there will be a time at which that will probably happen, but I'm thankful that it hasn't been yet. Unless that's the case, would you look up, and if I said which was your biggest failed business, would you look up and say it's that one? Or would you think, right, I didn't know where it was going to be. I just know this is direction I wanted to go in. And I tried one thing and that didn't work. So I tried something else and then that maybe didn't work. And I tried something else and now here I am and I'm doing it. Would you consider that to be a failure? And I think that's where a lot of people in this world gets tripped up, is failure this, failure that, failure this. Like you said, nothing ever starts or finishes the way that you actually thought it was going to happen. So if you think it's going to be a failure, then you're going to be really sadly disappointed.
Yeah, it's the yeah. I mean, yeah. I think of if I think about all the ones that failed, the ones that I would say are the greatest failures are the ones where it affected people the most. You know, like my last company had 55 people, and that's a lot of people. It's a lot of families, you know, and families of friends and dependents and things like that. So COVID happened, and because it was just like a whole sob story, but COVID happened, and you know, before COVID happened, we doubled revenues every year. We were scaling up. There was no reason there was no data point at all to suggest that a pandemic was going to come, and we went through 2 rounds of layoffs, and that fucking sucked. Like, that really sucked. And I also, like, I actually, there's a stat that another entrepreneur friend of mine, he runs an ad agency, very successful guy, won lots of awards, you know, true master of his craft. And he shared with me a stat, and he said, you know, he said, when do you, I was interviewing him, he says to me, Matt, when do you think most entrepreneurs are successful, quote unquote? And meaning, like, when do you have a liquidity event and you're financially free? And I was like, I don't know, 40, 45. And he was like, no, it's like the age of the most success when you start becoming rich and having liquidity events is in your 50s, mid 50s. And I was like, wow, that's quite an interesting insight. And I was having coffee with another entrepreneur friend of mine. His cousin is literally a dollar-based billionaire. And he said the same thing to him. He was like, you know, I spent pretty much my entire, you know, up to the time I was 55 odd, broke. Like, I didn't really have a liquidity event. But then all of a sudden it happens. And it's, my sense is that you have to have all these failures, quote unquote. You have to know what it feels like to be wrecked by your own ambition. Because I think ambition, especially when you're young, it's like if you tell Matt Brown when he was 26 that he could walk on water, he'd believe you, you know. And you have to mature and figure out a lot of shit that you can't read in a book. You know, like, you have to be QBE, or qualified by experience, so that over time you start to recognize, like, well, what does it actually take to be successful, to have enough, to have the right exit, to build the right type of business that's not project based, that's retained, that does this and not that, that doesn't subscribe to the Silicon Valley narrative, you know, that maybe is bootstrapped and privately owned and is a small giant, like Bo Burlingham literally wrote the book on it. And so it's such a personal, subjective journey. And it is true. Like, most entrepreneurs, like, they are broke because they're reinvesting in their businesses, right? And they don't draw down, unless you Sam Bankman-Fried, of course, different story. You know,
Oh boy.
yeah, god damn, have you seen the shit that's coming out on social media now, like today, with, oh, my word. Anyway, changing gears, but my point being, it's like, you have to have that experience to get to that end outcome, you know. Like, you sell for $1 million the first time, then you sell for 5 or 10, you know. And so it is a the earlier you start, the better off you are long term, Does that make sense? Does any of that resonate with you?
It does. So let me ask you this. Do you think, because the comment about experience that you made, right, really boils down to two things, right? It is expectations, and it's right. So it's managing your own expectations, managing the expectations of everybody around you and involved in what you're doing. That's one of the underlying components. And the other one, would you agree that the other piece of it is your willingness to actually change your perspective and your, I don't want to call it your goal, right? But if you're building a company, like you said, part of the maturation process is understanding that what you started isn't going to be the way it ends, and your openness to accepting those changes at different points. Because if you're not willing to do that and you force your way through unnaturally, you're going to have some bravado to push on what you believe in to get an idea off the ground. But if you're trying to constantly force, when the market's pushing you left and you're constantly forcing your way to the right, there's a breaking point at which you're going to be your own worst enemy. So I totally agree with you but a lot of it is expectation management, which is funny to think about because I guess we're all pretty bad at managing our own expectations, right?
Yeah, and yeah, it's such a interesting conversational point. Like I read about this in my book. Like I said, like, why do you want a certain scale? Like, why do you need to have $100 million? Like, why? Why does that matter to you? Is 10 million enough, or is 100 million too much? Or if you want 100 million, why don't you want a billion? You know what I'm saying? And like I was having a chat to my client in New York, Craig, who runs Granite Warehouse Management Software, and I said to him, like, how much is enough for you? And he was like, yeah, and it's always an interesting, fun question to have, like, how much is enough? And I was like, cool, I reckon $10 million I'd be good. I got 2 kids, put them through private school, college, great. Reinvest 5. I got 30 years of podcasting left. I don't work with my hands, so I can probably make money for another 30 years. I think I could get by comfortably, paid, how's it, like, go like a comfortable life for $10 million. He was like, 10 million, that's nothing. I was like, what's your number? He was like, 100 million. I'm like, yeah, but why do you want 100 million? You live in Cape Town in South Africa. It's like world's cheapest cost of living. Why do you need, how much? $100 million? That would be like it's like 2 billion rand. It's an astronomical number. But why does that matter? It's like you could buy all the cars in the world. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's so much money. It depending on where you are on your life stage, all that kind of stuff. But it's an interesting question. Like, how do you know how much is enough? Why do you want that kind of scale? And I think to the point that we're making here, Brendan, it is about experience. Like when you're 30, it's billionaire, and then when you hit 40, you start to realize that you probably won't be one, and you stop giving a shit about it.
Interesting.
It's like the older you get,
yeah, you're right. That's an interesting point, right? You hear all these things about people who are close to passing, and they say when you're on your deathbed, no one's going to care about how much of this you own and how much of that you own, right? But you're right. I guess that's an interesting point. Is maybe when you hit kind of that middle decade, you start to really think about mortality and what really means a lot in life, and some of the ambitions from a monetary perspective don't seem like a big deal at all. And when you're younger, that's a harder realization to make. So that's a really good point.
Cool. So Brennan, it's been great having you here. I was cognizant of time. So I want to ask you one more question, and then we'll wrap up. Why do you do what you do? Like, what gets you out of bed in the morning?
That is not a simple question, but the short answer is an actual impact. Is make an actual impact. I probably should have gone to medical school when I was younger, and I didn't because I was never a student. I didn't enjoy the schooling process and never would have made it through 8, 10, 12 years worth of schooling. So I didn't for that reason. But I would say I've always been an admirer of the medical profession because at the end of the day, it helps people. And I'd love it if everybody got along, kumbaya type of stuff. I love the concept of doing things for other people and everybody being happy, right? No one has to be miserable, or no one has to be unhealthy, or there's no reason that all of us can't just do that stuff together. So what gets me up and doing what we do is there are billions of screws, for our sake, right, in this company, that are put in every year, and the percentage of people that have to either go back for revisions or go back for secondary surgeries or have additional surgeries to either fix things or help solve things that just weren't solved 100%. The surgeons are frustrated about that because they got into medicine to help people. The patients get affected by that. Their families get affected by that. And if I could play a little role in making that bigger, then I will be extremely happy. So that's what kind of gets me up and gets me doing what I want to do every day.
Amazing. Brendan, thanks for being on the show, dude. It's been a privilege having you here, and obviously super excited to see where you guys are going to go, and hopefully I truly believe that you will make that impact that you want to make in the world. So thanks again for being here.
Appreciate it, Matt.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you again soon. Ciao.
Bye-bye.